Why do democracies have a nasty habit of falling apart? We hold them up as the ultimate form of government, the historical finish line. But history reminds us over and over again that they're not permanent. John Adams noted, "Democracy never lasts long, it commits suicide." But why and how? We often imagine tanks in the streets and soldiers at the television station. And for most of the 20th century, that was the case. During the Cold War, nearly 3 out of 4 failed democracies ended with a military coup. But in more modern times, they fall in a much different way. I'm Ken LaCourte. I look at tough questions like this, especially ones loaded with history and emotion and uncomfortable truths. And today's elephant in the room is this: why do democracies commit suicide? I looked at both ancient and modern history to help understand that question, and I hope I give you a fair overview of what I've learned. We'll take a look at the Fall of Athens to see how the world's first democracy imploded. We'll explore how they die, the last gasps of democracies. Then examine how they get sick from the inside out. And finally, we'll take a look at the United States today and ask, is it bending or breaking? Let's look at the Fall of Athens. How does the world's first democracy end up executing Socrates, elevating demagogues, getting conquered, and disappearing from history? Athens didn't fall in a single day, and it's a good lesson in what can happen when you hand power to the crowd. It evolved over time, and it was unique in the world in that its citizens, or at least those who were adult, male, and not slaves, were allowed to vote and directly make governmental decisions. They met in a forum that would often hold 6,000 men and voted not to elect other leaders, but they voted directly on proposed laws. It was groundbreaking, and it was also unsustainable. Socrates saw it coming. He warned that democracy could turn into a ship where untrained passengers ignore the navigator and follow the smoothest talking sailor. A few decades later, he'd be sentenced to death by a 500-man jury. They officially killed him for corrupting the youth and impiety, but really for questioning the established order, because they were the established order. The turning point came earlier, when an eloquent speaker convinced Athens to invade Sicily. He sold it as a quick, glorious win. Instead, it was a disaster. The fleet was wiped out, and Athens, which had been winning the Peloponnesian War, never recovered. A few years later, a group of local oligarchs decided democracy failed, and they seized power. Control went back and forth a few times until Philip of Macedon crushed the Greek city-states and ended Athenian self-rule. And maybe coincidentally, to this day, the Greeks really don't like the Macedonians all that much. But Athens wasn't conquered because it was weak. It was conquered because it made itself weak. It died from exhaustion, years of war, swings between populism and elitism, and the citizens who saw rivals as threats instead of neighbors. Democracy means self-rule, but it can also mean asking flawed people to restrain themselves in using power and to resist the urge to follow whomever flatters them the best. So let's first take a look at the ways democracies take their last breaths, how they literally die, because it happens different ways. And if you look at history, patterns emerge. But first, I want to mention the opposite, dictatorships, because they usually don't go quietly. Think Mussolini hanged upside down by a mob. Gaddafi pulled from a sewer pipe and shot on camera. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena, they were lined up against a wall and shot. Authoritarian regimes look strong right up until the moment they fall. When the fear cracks, it usually happens fast. Power was so concentrated that the moment the center falls, there's usually nothing to hold it up. But democracies, they usually don't die like that. Some get invaded, some get overthrown, some get voted out of existence, and each path says something about that system's failures. Let's start with foreign conquest, because sometimes the enemy marches in, like in Athens. It happened to Czechoslovakia in 1939 when Hitler swallowed it. And it happened to the Baltic states in 1940 when Stalin's tanks rolled in and puppet regimes popped up overnight. I mean, literally one day you're voting for parliament, the next Moscow is sending your politicians to the gulag. More often, though, the death blow comes from the inside, sometimes with a bang. Chile, 1973. Salvador Allende is elected. He's a Marxist president facing deep economic chaos. The military, led by Augusto Pinochet, bombs the presidential palace. Allende is killed. A military junta takes power and holds it for almost 20 years. Egypt, 2012. After the Arab Spring, Mohamed Morsi became Egypt's first democratically elected president ever. His presidency lasted just a year before the military pushed him out following widespread protests. A general has won essentially fake elections there ever since. Those were fairly typical military takes over ends, and they often happened with popular support because either the conditions in the country or the elected leader was just that bad. But the most common path today? Countries vote their way into it. It's the strongman route. A charismatic leader rides on a wave of anger, always with real and serious problems underneath. They promise to clean house and fix the system, and if voters give them the power to do it, democracy slowly becomes optional. Weimar Germany in the 30s. Hitler doesn't take power in a coup, he wins a plurality, gets legally appointed chancellor, then uses the Reichstag fire to push emergency laws. Within months, democracy's dead. And he didn't really break the rules, he just used them differently. Venezuela, 1992. I saw the start of this one firsthand. I will never forget working there and talking to people who weren't all that sold on democracy, which I found shocking. The upper class had nostalgia about the military governments, with low crime and a sense of order. And the other Venezuelans thought that the parties were corrupt. Military man Hugo Chavez first tries a coup that fails, then runs as a populist in 1998, promising to smash the corrupt elite. He wins, rewrites the Constitution, packs the courts, shut down the media, and then he turned the system into a tool for essentially permanent power, all with popular backing, even from idealistic actors. Before that story was over, people ate their pets and zoo animals during food shortages, and about a quarter of the population fled the country. Turkey. Erdogan starts in 2003 as a reformer. A decade later, he's purged the military, neutered the judiciary, and turned Turkey into what people call a competitive autocracy. Elections still happen, but the ruling party controls the board and losses are rare. Turkey didn't implode like Venezuela, and this version of collapse can be harder to see because the institutions stay in place. The courts, the legislature, even the elections. You can still vote, but your vote may not matter that much. And again, in recent years, this has been more likely to occur with an eager population. Heck, even in the Galactic Republic.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Now let's pause for a second and ask, why should we really care about why democracies fail? I mean, all governments eventually fail, so why does it matter? Because for all their mess and dysfunction, democracies are still the best government humanity has come up with. Objectively, comparatively, historically, they give their citizens advantages that most people wouldn't trade away. Democracies let people fire their leaders without bloodshed. They give you the right to speak, protest, and vote. They spread power out, which makes it harder for people to abuse it. You don't need to shoot your way into office or swear loyalty to a dictator. If you care enough, you can fight to change the system, and if enough people agree with you, you can succeed. That's rare throughout history. Democracies also tend to protect basic rights, speech, religion, due process, because they have to. Leaders need support to stay in power, and the feedback loop keeps them in check. It's not perfect, but in real democracies, you don't get jailed or worse for speaking out against the leader. And that happens today in China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Venezuela, and so many other countries. About half of the world lives under an authoritarian state. And any look at the data shows that democracies tend to do better to help people with longer lives, better health, higher standards of living, and more innovation. They also go to war less often, and almost never with each other. I mean, wars still happen, of course, but statistically, democratic countries are far less likely to start them, especially against other democracies. And that saved millions of lives. And it's what makes their collapse so troubling, because when democracies fail, people lose more than just some government style. Okay, so I talked about the final death of democracies, but that doesn't happen overnight. Let's look at how they get sick. First, some common reasons, and then we'll take a look at a couple myths. Because here as well, you could see recurring patterns throughout history. And the baseline is usually the same, with government failure in doing some basic jobs, like economics or safety. Then, a general distrust of the system and a strong polarization. Let's start with that, as disagreement turns into stronger tribalism. Because identity wars rot democracy. The whole idea of a loyal opposition breaks down. Instead of arguing with people, you write them off as immoral, dangerous, even evil. At its core, democracy is a compromise machine. You vote, you lose sometimes, you live with it. And that only works when the opposition is seen as legitimate. Once that line's crossed, the normal rules stop applying. The Spanish Republic in the 1930s is a textbook case. Left and right didn't just disagree, they saw each other as existential threats. The rhetoric got hotter, violence broke out, and by 1936, the country was in a full-blown civil war. In the final years of the Roman Republic, rival politicians funded street gangs to beat or kill opponents. A related symptom? Institutional distrust. Democracy isn't just elections, it's trust in the process, the courts, the media, the legislature, the whole machinery. And when that trust breaks down, people stop accepting outcomes they don't like. They start believing the game is rigged, and maybe it was. Germany, in the 1920s, had a new democratic constitution. It also had serious economic problems and humiliation after World War I, and political street brawls. People on both sides thought that the other was cheating or planning a coup, and by the time Hitler was appointed in 1933, a lot of Germans had given up on the system. Same thing in Peru, 1992. President Fujimori shut down Congress and ruled by decree. And a lot of Peruvians cheered him on, because to them, the institutions had become punchlines, corrupt, paralyzed. When the courts are a joke and politicians are clowns, a strong man doesn't look so bad. Now, let me talk about two factors you see everywhere that are a little closer to myth than really driving reasons. And the first is voter apathy. It's almost said as a given. When people stop participating, especially at the ballot box, democracy starts to falter. And that apathy creates a vacuum that gets filled by the most extreme voices. But I just didn't see good examples. I saw more often the opposite. I mean, oftentimes when people are pretty good with their governments, a lot of them don't vote. I mean, you can see that in the United States. As an anecdote, 44 years ago, it looked as if a KKK member was going to win the Louisiana governor's race. People cared about that, and turnout almost doubled to 82%, defeating him. The more I researched, the less I saw evidence of apathy playing a role in countries losing democracy. It was really more driven by a frustration that their votes meant nothing. And there's another common concept that isn't quite a myth, but it's worth discussing, because people usually have it backwards. Virtually every write-up talks about how the final act in a dying democracy comes at the hand of a charismatic populist leader. And yes, that's usually the case, but it occurs after the system has already been hollowed out. That last leader is really the end result rather than the primary cause of the collapse. When a government is seen as performing its basic needs, a leader like that can't rise to power. But when things are going to hell, someone will always be there to step into that role. And one factor that seems to supersede all others, economic misery. When people lose their jobs, their savings, their ability to put food on the table, they don't stay patient. They get desperate and angry. And fancy talk about constitutions and social norms, that sounds like a bunch of elites worried about the wrong things. Again, back to Germany. In 1923, inflation hit 30,000% per month. They used to pay workers twice a day because the money was literally worth less hour by hour. Kids would play with stacks of money because they were cheaper than toys. People sometimes needed wheelbarrows to move their cash. The middle class saw their life savings wiped out, and when the 1929 depression came, unemployment went past 30%. That desperation drove more people to Hitler than Mein Kampf. I mentioned Chile's president, Salvador Allende, getting overthrown in 1973. There, inflation blew past 500%, and basic goods vanished from the stores. They had mass protests, strikes, violence before the military took over. A similar pattern happened in Brazil in 1964 and a lot of other countries. When a good number of people think that the system is broken and can't handle the basics of why they want a government to exist, it opens a door for somebody to walk in and say, this isn't working anymore, let's try something different. Okay, so now I need to pause for just a minute because I don't want to lose the plot here. Yes, democracies can be vulnerable. Yes, they've collapsed in big ways, in real places, with real consequences. But that's only half the story. The other half is resilience, because while democracies can die, the mature ones tend to last. The United States has been a democratic republic since electing George Washington in 1789, and is one of the oldest continuous governments on the planet. It's weathered a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, political assassination, civil rights upheaval, and a lot of other governments throughout the world are long-standing democracies because they can absorb shocks and changes. Democracies are resilient because the feedback system works better than under a dictatorship. Think of any problem. The press notices it, the opposition complains, and the leadership can either deal with it or get less popular. The continual complaining and debating in a free society, that makes them stronger. Will they last forever? Well, probably not. But here's the twist. Nothing lasts forever. Empires and regimes have been rising and falling since before recorded human history, thousands and thousands of years. Growing up in a stable country like the United States, it's easy to fall into the notion that we've reached the final stage of government. But this one book, it's a wall chart. It really brought history into focus for me. It lays out essentially every known major government's beginning and ending. And in that huge document, I can literally cover up the entire history of the United States with one hand. But even when governments fall, they leave something behind. Institutions, movements, political muscle memory. Countries often learn by failing. The first draft collapses, and more get rewritten. Human progress isn't linear, and even broken democracies can rebuild. After World War II, Germany and Japan emerged from dictatorship and war to become stable, liberal democracies. Chile came back from Pinochet. South Korea moved from military rule to a democratic country. These aren't flukes. They're evidence that given time and will, democracies can re-engineer themselves, and they usually emerge stronger after a failure. So, where does the United States stand today? Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into today's political trench warfare. On this channel, I sometimes get politically adjacent, but I'm not trying to get you to vote one way or another. I'm just trying to help you get a little bit more knowledgeable about the big picture. And when people start talking about partisan issues, too many care less about understanding and more about just winning the argument. But we're certainly living in an era where people are openly wondering whether our democracy is under siege and how it might fare. Now, some of that's political theater and some of it's genuine fear. So I'd like to take a very broad look at where things stand right now in the United States, the signals we're getting, and how they stack up against history. Certainly the tribalism is here. 72% of Republicans and 63% of Democrats say the other side is immoral. And I could show you lots of charts about people's declining trust in institutions. It's real, and it's a problem. One side could point to Trump's refusal to concede in 2020 and a mob storming the Capitol as Congress was trying to count the electoral votes. The other side can point to an abuse by the intelligence agencies to gin up a false Russia collusion narrative and the weaponization of the legal system to jail the leading opposition candidate. And the media environment isn't really helping, so there's often no shared reality. The end result is that we have a system under stress with many people convinced the other side is corrupt beyond repair and that they're the ones defending democracy itself. Still, let's zoom out a bit, because this isn't the first time the American democracy has looked like it was coming apart. I won't even get into the Civil War. Let's start more recently. In the 1930s, the Great Depression had the country reeling. Unemployment hit 25%, banks collapsed, and the global democratic order was cracking. Germany, Italy, Japan, they were turning to fascism, and there were serious debates in the United States about whether democracy was the right path. Some business leaders openly admired the orderly nature of a Hitler or Mussolini. Others admire the Soviet-style planning. And we've been a lot more turbulent, even in my lifetime. In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Then, his successor stepped down over the war protests. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and 2 months later, so was Robert Kennedy. The Democratic National Convention, it turned into a televised riot. Cities burned, and Richard Nixon rose on a wave of law and order, then resigned, assuring us that he wasn't a crook. In a 2-year period in the early 70s, radicals set off over 2,000 bombs in the United States, and armed resistance was a reality. If you study the politics of that era, you'll look at today's politics differently. It also helps to look at the strengths of our system, which just don't make the headlines. Now, I'm going to do a whole piece on the 2020 election because a lot of people need to hear that. Because we have a strong and decentralized election system with multiple layers of oversight and judicial review. Our military stays out of politics. Voter turnout is still strong. People argue about politics, but they're still invested in the system despite their worries. The economy is solid. And when you compare it to countries that fell apart, it's on a whole different level. Yes, we saw inflation rise, but in the 80s, we saw inflation up to 15%, and mortgage rates were up to 18%. Unemployment now is historically low. People are still buying homes, they're starting businesses, they're taking vacations. In fact, when you turn off your phone or your computer, the country and the whole world look a whole lot better. The rhetoric is hotter, but the machinery is still holding up, so far. So we have both of these elements to consider and deal with. Rising distrust and tribalism layered on top of a system that still, to me, looks like a strong foundation. This certainly isn't a call to be complacent, not by a long shot, but it is a call to look at the large picture. I learned a lot in researching this, and I hope I did a good job passing that on to you. You know, I talked about how crazy things were in the United States in the not-too-distant past. Looking back, some of that was just insane, especially with the government doing creepy things like surveilling political leaders, even bugging Martin Luther King Jr. and encouraging him to kill himself. I got into it in this video, and it's truly mind-boggling. Hey, thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope you got something worthwhile here. See you next time.